the hideous infinite scroll. Our brains are wired to want to get to the end of the task. And so when we do something physical, like sewing something or making something or, whatever it might be, we have an end product to it. And so when we're on our phones or on social media, the reason we have that tendency to just keep scrolling is because our brains are looking for the end of the magazine or the end of the book or the end of the feed, which of course is never ever going to happen.
Hello, listeners. Now, as somebody that's always had an affinity with vintage, makes content that keeps history alive, and lives in a 1940s inspired house, if you ask me what I think is good about the modern world, I would say healthcare, technology, and convenience. I mean, healthcare's a given. And I'm always super excited to see where technology can take us next. Closet gamer here, but keep that to yourself. And I often think that I'd probably struggle if I lived in a time where things weren't as convenient. However, I would never want to grow up in the world as it is today. And I think if I did, I'd be a very different person, and sadly, not in a good way. Well, joining me today is the incredible Miriam Hobbs, educational researcher and deputy head teacher, to talk to us about how the modern world is affecting our adolescents and potentially stripping away the joy of the task. Miriam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Can I just say, love your entire vibe. Love your outfit, love your hair, love the glasses, love the red lipstick. You look
People always say that
fabulous
to me. They say, "Oh, I love your costume," and I'm like, "Well, it's just my clothes, but thanks."
Just my clothes, but cheers. You look fantastic. Like, I love that. Like, it's kind of like the vibe is like it's a little bit vintage, a little bit academia. It's just brilliant. And thank you so much. So Miriam messaged me on Instagram, and that's how we connected. And basically, after I'd sort of dropped very minor hints about my podcast, you just understood exactly what I was getting at really, really quickly, that was pretty cool. So when I read about your message about how you thought you could assist me with traversing these questions about the modern world, I was like, oh my goodness, yes. And I'm very excited to speak to you. And when you told me about your lifestyle and your past and your experiences growing up, I was like, this is the perfect matrimony. So that's where I want to start, if that's all right, because I like to get to know my guests a little bit. So you're a bit of an advocate for a sort of make, do and mend lifestyle, and I would love to know where that started for you.
But I think for me, I mean, firstly, I have not an issue, but I think when we think about make do now, it has a really negative connotation. It implies that there's something better out there, but we can't access it. And so we're just going to make do with something. And for me, I suppose I have been most greatly influenced by my parents. My parents are the most creative people that I know. And, they weren't like, painters and musicians, they weren't bards and troubadours, living a hippie lifestyle through the 70s. But they were creative in the way that they lived their life, and they made an amazing childhood for us. I've got 3 siblings, and my father was always mending things and fixing cars and bringing bits home, filling our house up with all sorts of really interesting artifacts that he was mending. And my mum still is an amazing seamstress. She's a dressmaker. She does beautiful quilting, baking, preserving, all sorts of things like that. And I'm aware, perhaps as an adult, that came from a place of necessity for them. It was, I didn't know it as a child, but we were perhaps what schools would recognise now as a low-income family when I was very small. And so it came as necessity for them. They didn't have access to credit that people have now, and to overdrafts, and to use money in the way that it is today. And so they had to kind of make do. But to me, it was just this incredible space of creativity and independence, because if you can fix something, then you are independent of whatever systems or structures that perhaps now we are really bound by. No one is out there fixing their car anymore. You have to take it to a garage. There are fewer options. So I'm an advocate of the lifestyle, because I think that there is a certain creativity and playfulness in it, and an independence that makes you less bound by other social structures that otherwise you wouldn't have a choice but to use.
I think when you said about, well, no, there's so many things that I think is just fascinating about what you've just said. Number one, I also grew up from a single parent family, and at times very close to the poverty line. So I can echo what you've said about sometimes make, do, and mend was a necessity, not like an aesthetic choice. In fact, it was never an aesthetic choice when I was growing up. It was just what needed to happen. And I think you're right. I think make, do, and mend looks like, sort of sounds like these days like a bit negative. Like, oh, shame you have to just make do. It's like, oh, it's a shame you think that making do is a negative thing. But what I've not heard before is how by making do and mending and sort of adopting that attitude in your own lifestyle, you can take back a bit of control, because we are bound to certain rules and regulations, whereas in eras gone by we wouldn't have been. You would have fixed things yourself to your own standard, and we can't do that as much now, which I find very interesting, because we are bound to social constructs quite heavily today. Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. I think that people have fewer choices now. I can remember as a child my father being out on the street, tuning the engine of the car, just by ear. And that was a
Wow.
skill that I don't have. Don't get me wrong, I do not have. I would love to have a nice vintage Morris Minor out on my driveway that I go out on weekends and
Oh,
fix.
oh yeah, that'd be
Sadly, I
nice.
don't have that skill. Yeah, that would be lovely. That would be the icing on the cake. But I think that we're bound both by the social structures that make us believe that we have to do things a certain way. Some of it is technologically driven. So, in the same analogy as cars, they're so computerized now, most people don't have the technology in their homes to be able to fix problems. So we are bound in that way, but it is also just a de-skilling. If I want to update something like, my clothes or something like that, and I can take all the buttons off and replace all the buttons, there's still a level of skill required there. And many people, particularly young people, will say to me, oh yeah, but I don't know how to do that. And sadly, a lot of the young people that I speak to, in a variety of different spheres, not just at my school, but in my life, it is a sense that they not only do they not have the skill, but they don't have anybody in their life who also has the skill from whom they can learn it. And not worry is too strong a word, but it is on my mind often that we have far fewer skills now than perhaps we did 50 years ago, and we have a much lower focus and concentration level than we had 50 years ago, which is another concern of mine, particularly for young people growing up in the 21st century.
And mine too. And recently I spoke to a historian on this podcast, and he told me a really interesting fact. I think you'll love this. So, did you know that when writing became a thing, the human population's memory got worse? So before writing, people would have to learn off by heart thousands and thousands of words of particular books that they were following at the time, scripture and things like that, and that was their education. That was the standard education back then, learning thousands and thousands of words. When writing was invented and we didn't have to learn, our memory got worse. And it's just one small, very, very, very old example. But that's happening now, but I think in more damaging ways. Because like you said, it could relate to absolutely every facet of life. What you drive, what you eat, what you wear. Nowadays, things are so easily disposable. There is no effort needed anymore. And I don't think young people would even think, oh, I really fancy a pizza. I think the first thought would be, we'll order in, not, oh, how fun would it be to make a pizza at home? Like, how fun would it be to make the dough? I wonder how you make dough. I wonder how you bake bread. Like you say, I wonder how you change a car battery. I wonder how you sew a button. But it's not the nature of the world that we live in now, because there's an app for everything. Everything's online. Everything's so accessible at our fingertips. If I want pretty much anything, I can order it within half an hour. And that's kind of crazy. So nothing we do is self-sufficient anymore because it doesn't need to be. And if you're a young person that's only grown up with that, all of that at your fingertips to get whatever you want without requiring any effort, you, like you said, why would you think, oh, I'll sew that button. I won't buy a new cardigan. I'll just sew it. That narrative, that way of thinking isn't there for them. And it's what I was really interested in your doctoral research that you're currently doing, this idea of the joy of the task. So do you feel that as a society, and I don't know if this is just Western society mainly or worldwide, are we losing a sense of the joy of the task and the joy of doing?
I 100% do believe that. My research has so the main driver in my research is looking at how we can improve and support motivation and self-efficacy in young people. And part of the issue is our young people are living in this huge paradox where on the one hand they've got a mini computer in their pocket that can be used for literally anything, to access any piece of information they want to find, but they don't use it for that. They use it in, on the whole, really quite destructive ways, or certainly not very healthy ways. It's sort of the junk food, I suppose, of the intellectual space. And they don't believe, or many people, I think, of all generations, don't necessarily believe that they could do something. So they might watch a video, have it in their TikTok or whatever other platforms they're using. I'm not an expert on any of that. And see somebody doing something really beautiful or making something really clever or doing some baking or whatever it might be, but they don't perceive themselves to be able to also do that if they wanted to. So they, on the one hand, could look up a skill, but they don't believe, yeah, I could do that, I'll have a go. And that kind of concept of just being someone that has a go at fixing it, and what's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is that it's not fixed, or the bread tastes horrible, or the jam doesn't set, or whatever it might be. But it's the unwillingness, perhaps, or not even unwillingness, it's the not thinking that they could in the first place. And the joy of the task, I think, has been eroded because we live in a culture now where everything is about the outcome. When you look at even in an Instagram feed, the pictures are so beautiful and the aesthetic are so gorgeous, and a lot of the things that I follow is artwork really that just really inspires me, or people's lifestyles that inspire me. But that's the finished product. You didn't see that person making that house that way, or making a mistake, or making a sewing error. We only ever publish that looks already perfect. And so their self-efficacy is really driven by, firstly, that it's not their first thought that they could do something, but then also impacted, well, if I try, I'm not going to be as good as that person that I've seen online. And it's really impacted by the perfectionism, I suppose, of the internet. So the joy of the task isn't there. It isn't a case of, well, I'm going to do something just because it might be a really enjoyable thing to do in and of itself. It's a, well, I don't know if I'll do that because I won't get to my desired outcome, which I think is really sad.
And it's the entire reason, I think, a lot of the people I follow even have a following. Because if everybody watched my content, or any of the people I've interviewed's content, where we are living a more make-do-and-mend lifestyle, we're living via simpler standards in a bit of a simpler, calmer kind of way, if that was accessible to everybody, or at least if everybody thought, oh, I could do that, we would have no following. Because the whole reason the following is large is because people are like, oh, wow. I mean, I could never do that, but, it's cool to live it through them. And it's like, but you could do that. And that's really interesting to me, that we would have no following if everybody thought it was accessible to them, or if everybody had the notion, oh, well, that could be me. And you're right. They don't.
Yeah.
It is the junk food of social media, because the junk food of the internet, because what we could use the internet for is pretty incredible, but we don't, because, and I was reading in your research, we get that dopamine hit, that instant kind of gratification, and it's like we're being hooked in, and how are young people ever supposed to escape that? And that idea of perfection I mean, it's kind of what interests me is, why do we even get a dopamine hit? To be honest, because actually, watching social media could be so detrimental to your mental health sometimes because of the element of perfection, and you rarely see the order of which things had to happen to get to that photograph. You rarely see the behind the scenes. All you often see is the photograph, is the video, which is perfectly edited, has a lovely voiceover, has a great soundtrack, has a lovely filter on it. But that's not reality. And so why do we get this dopamine hit off social media, even though actually what it does to us later down the line is make us go, oh, we're not good enough?
I think, well, certainly my research has demonstrated that most people in kind of like that, so the age bracket of the sample in my studies have been between the ages of 11 and 18. But I see it a lot in my own, so my own children are in their 20s, and I see it a lot in my own children, and I think I probably also would recognise it now in myself. So I don't even think this is generational. I think that anybody who has now embraced the internet and uses it in that social capacity probably experiences the same thing, because the research demonstrates that our relationship with reward is less about what we might get. So typically you might remember being at school and your teacher says, oh, that's a brilliant piece of work, and you get a lolly or a cookie or something like that, something really tangible. And that reward is of very limited value to young people. What they talk about in wanting to be rewarded is a sense of recognition. So they want to be known for or seen to be good or have done well, or to feel like people in their life are proud of them. And so things like phone calls home, certificates, stickers, ticks, all those sorts of things are much more higher value to them, and because they're instant. So when we translate that into the worlds of the internet that typically younger generations engage in, their reward is the likes and the validation and the notifications, and every time they get a notification they're being recognised by somebody within their space, or every time they get a like they're being told, yeah, that was a great video, or that was a really good picture. And so I suppose their relationship with it, the dopamine comes from both continually seeking validation and seeking reward, but it also comes from, of course, the hideous infinite scroll. Our brains are wired to want to get to the end of the task. And so when we do something physical, like sewing something or making something or, whatever it might be, we have an end product to it. And so when we're on our phones or on social media, the reason we have that tendency to just keep scrolling is because our brains are looking for the end of the magazine or the end of the book or the end of the feed, which of course is never ever going to happen because it is now infinite scroll. In the early days of the internet, I think it is Johann Hari maybe, who talks about infinite scroll in his book Stolen Focus. And in the early days of social media, there were pages, so you'd get to the end of like your Facebook feed, for example, and then you'd have to physically click onto page 2 or to page 3 or to page 4. And when infinite scroll came in, that was a massive game changer, because if you had to click onto the next page, you were more likely to think, right, that's it now, I've looked at 2 pages, in the same way that you might think, right, well, I'll get to the end of my page and then I'll put my book down.
Yes.
And so with infinite scroll, the page is endless, and so you're constantly looking for that validation, both in others and for yourself, and you just can't put it down. So
no, because you can't quantify, you can't say, well, I'll give it, like you said, I'll give it 2 more pages. I'll get to the end of this page and then that's me done. And I think, as human creatures, we like to assign meaning to things. We like things to make a bit of chronological sense. So I couldn't read a sentence and just stop midway through the sentence.
No,
because as human beings, that would be just weird, and it just wouldn't be the way we do it. We like to give a bit of narrative to things, have chapters. So infinite scroll, no wonder I can't imagine being, younger than this, to be fair, because I know there are younger people on social media than this, but like 11 and just having that infinite content just thrown at me for me just to consume.
Absolutely.
And it makes so much sense now why we get stuck in such a damaging loop, because I was like, why are we all here? Why do we even like it? Because half the time we complain that social media is bad for your mental health, and that social media makes perfection seem like the thing that everyone's aspiring to be, even though you can never be perfect. So why are we all here? Why are we still watching? Why are we still liking? But you're right, we are after our little slice of it. We want our gratification. We want our recognition. We want our little selection of likes. And the minute you are thinking, oh, I'm going to stop scrolling now, and then all of a sudden you see someone's liked your video or someone's made a comment, you're back, you're hooked again. And that cycle must be so hard to break, let alone growing up with it. Although I agree with you, it's not generational, because everybody who has decided to jump down that rabbit hole with us, I think, are suffering in the same way. But what I don't understand, I mean, it's probably far too complicated a notion for this particular podcast, but I don't understand why platforms are designed the way they want to, the way that they're designed these days. I'm guessing it's because of advertising, and it's making the owners of the platforms a lot of money because we are just constantly consuming. But I find it very, very, very sad. I mean, I don't know about if you know anything about why the algorithm is the way it is, or if your research has tapped into that much.
I'm not an expert. Some of the reading that I've done has touched on it. I wouldn't say that I'm a critical expert on it, but certainly advertising plays a massive role. So whenever anything is free, you have to think to yourself, well, if this is free for me to use, then I am the product. And so that whole concept of all the while they can keep you scrolling, and there's shopping and there's adverts, or this link takes you to that link, and that whole kind of cookie crumb approach that the internet uses, the algorithms are designed to, psychologists are involved in the designs of algorithms and then in the designs of social media spaces to make them as addictive as possible, to keep you connected to your phone. And then once we put other apps on there, like, for example, our banking apps or our work email or whatever it might be, to make it convenient for us, which I think is a real benefit of today's smartphone. It is, there are huge possibilities for it making the world far more environmentally friendly, for example, reducing the amount of paper that's being used, all those sorts of things. But if I go on to check my bank account, or if I go on to do something for work and I see all my notifications, then I am also going to, while I'm here, check out on the things that people have liked on my feed. And I think certainly, I think for all people, but particularly in the demographic that I've been studying, they are connected all of the time. So they might be in group chats with their whole year group. So if you imagine the number of notifications that are going to be coming to them, it's absolutely overwhelming. But there is a massive difference between communication and connection. And I think part of so my handle on Instagram is makes and mends, because I don't like the phrase make do. So I'm somebody who makes things and I mend things. And that's how I kind of rationalised it in my mind. But to be in that space, if I, for example, wanted to learn how to do something, I could find another person or a community or a group, a knit and natter or a crochet club or whatever it might be, and it creates a sense of connection. So for me, I think this lifestyle still has massive opportunity for, I suppose, the Jam and Jerusalem sort of psychology about it, I suppose, being in connection and in communion with other people. When we just look at digital spaces, it is just communication. There is no personal connection there. There's no real connection there. And it's one of my favourite researchers into that is Brené Brown. And she talks a lot about the space in which we can engage in connection, and connection enables us to be more authentic and vulnerable, and to deal with feelings of shame and all those sorts of things, where our relationships with people are a higher quality and are more true. But the digital space doesn't really allow for that, because we only ever present the way that we want to be seen rather than the way that we actually are, which I think is quite isolating.
And so ironic that it's called, having an internet connection or having a Wi-Fi connection.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, it isn't at all, because
no.
One of the reasons that I started this podcast, try not to use you as a therapist, promise, but it's because I felt a bit lonely. So I've got a lot of followers. Gosh, I'm a drop in the ocean, really, but I've got a sizable following, and because of that sizable following, I will go on to pretty much any app and it will say 99 plus notifications, because the highest number of notifications you can get at any one time is 99. TikTok doesn't have the way to say you've got 1,022 notifications. It's just 99 plus if it's anything over that. And it's that every single day. And on Instagram, I'll have message requests. Just, I just keep scrolling and there's so many message requests and I'll never, ever, ever have time to read them all. And because of those notifications feeling so overwhelming, I miss WhatsApps from people quite often. I'll often go into my WhatsApps and I've got 5 unread messages from various different people and I'll think, oh, bugger. And some of them might have been unread for 2 days. So people kind of give up on me. But none of these notifications, like you said, were offering me connection. I could communicate if I wanted to, if I ever felt not too overwhelmed to do so, but I wasn't getting connection. And although I love making content, it's a pretty lonely game making content on your on your own of a Saturday afternoon, just to post, and then the notifications will roll in and that gratification, that recognition will come. That's lovely, but it wasn't enough for me. And coming from like a theatre background and studying theatre, and I used to work with young people. I was kind of the same age as them when I worked with them, but still worked with young people. And I also work in the NHS. I work in death, so I have a lot of sometimes quite unique perspective. And I realised it wasn't good enough for me. This wasn't good enough for me. It wasn't giving me what I needed. Whether I'm on 600,000 followers or 2 million, it really does not matter. It's not really going to make much difference because you are not getting connection. You're just getting, you're just messaging, or sometimes not even that. So I completely understand what you're saying there, and that's why I started a podcast, because this is connection. This is real connection. This is actually talking, and I needed that because I felt like my soul was dying off, and that's why I started asking the big questions about the modern world and creative burnout and screen time and no attention span and all these big, unfathomable issues. And what saddens me is, I agree with you, the environmental advances, I am so for them. I'm so for them, because some of the stuff that that technology can bring us is brilliant, and some of it is terrifying. My friend at work was showing me the new Apple VR headset the other day. That's like £3,000 or something ridiculous. And I was like, oh, okay, what is that then? And he showed me this tutorial video where someone put on the VR headset and there's all your apps merged into your real world. So it's your living room, but your apps are there and you can click them and scroll, and you can make the photos as big as you like, and you can make platforms as big as you like and scroll with a gesture. And I didn't know whether to be excited or scared, because I was like, wow, I don't know how this makes me feel. And for adolescents, the whole narrative of growing up has changed so much in only a few short years. Like you said, people
absolutely.
Even all of my generation, everyone like in their 20s, everybody in their 30s. Now we're nothing like the adolescents that are coming. And I find your research really fascinating, and I want to talk about their development a little bit, if that's all right. How an adolescent, how a young person develops, and what's important and key to their development, and how they navigate the world from then on. Is a world of instant gratification and having an app for that, and basically living online, affecting their development? And if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely is. And I always feel like a really old person when I complain about this, and I suppose I want to frame my thinking also with my genuine belief that our younger generation is our great hope. This is not about me thinking, right, well, that younger generation, they don't know what it's like, and not at all. They are our greatest hope. And if they mobilise, we will see environmental change and economic change and social change in the blink of an eye, because they would be able to connect people because they are really skilled at using some of the social media tools, I suppose, and using them as tools. And so they are our great hope, but I suppose as they are a little microcosm of society that we see, one of the things that social media is doing is, because it is disconnecting, but the instantaneousness, that Amazon Prime generation that they are, that desire to have everything now and to have everything immediately, I think is impacting on their sense of patience, being patient with people as well as with staff, or out in the community, being served in a shop and expecting the server to come over immediately and have it right now. And like I say, I don't think that it is just them. I think that is more pervasive throughout all of society now. It's becoming worse. But for them, it is all that they've known, that instantaneousness, and the convenience. So in some ways, their lives, I think, are much harder than certainly mine was. I wasn't worrying about what I looked like when I woke up on a Saturday morning, because I didn't have to, FaceTime anybody right there and then. And even my own children in their 20s, they all say to me, I'm so glad that, they were just a little bit too old to be on all the social media platforms when they were like in year 7 and 8. So, they kind of, I'm glad that I didn't have to be a parent. I never had to deal, for example, with cyberbullying or anything like that, for my own children as a parent. But the instantaneousness of everything and the having an app for everything worries me for all generations, because I think that it is also replacing our thinking. So if you are being governed by an app, then you're not learning to trust yourself, and you're not learning to problem solve, and you're missing out on that whole creative aspect of thinking that is, well, this is an issue, or I need to get this done quicker, or actually maybe I need to slow down. And I wonder if it also impacts their decision making. So as everything is so instantaneous, if they are, for example, they meet somebody, are they going then at higher risk of jumping into a relationship much quicker, going through very normal, slower stages of relationship building faster, because everything in their life is at a quicker pace? And it's those sorts of things which I don't feel like are being properly researched at the moment, and should be, that impact of the instant lifestyle, and what impact it might be having on other aspects of our social relationships, because that's all that they've ever known, is that things are supposed to be happening at a tremendous speed, and actually not everything has to happen at that speed. We can do everything at whatever speed that we feel comfortable with, and whatever speed we like, and that's okay. And I think that's a little bit lost.
It is like your children. My mum wouldn't have had to deal with the cyberbullying with me, and thank goodness. I don't think I would have liked it. Like I said at the beginning of this podcast, I don't think I would have liked to have grown up today, which I find that really sad to say, but I wouldn't have liked it, because what I've taken from watching my mum and growing up in the environment I grew up in, where the internet was there, but everything was being developed. It was a slow burn. Everything was a slow burn back then. It wasn't instant like it is now. I feel a bit like a more fully formed person who is a bit more, well, I don't want to say a bit more, because I'm sure there's loads of young people that are like this, but I'm quite measured, I'm quite grounded. I can be patient, although, as I have deep dived into the world of social media, I found that has changed within me. I do want things to be now. And doing this podcast, which, to this day of talking to you, not a single episode has been posted yet, because I'm really taking my time. It's been a challenge, but I've taken my time. And I think you're right. With young people who've known nothing but, you can have anything you want at your fingertips within just a few minutes. No wonder it's affecting how they literally communicate with everybody in their lives. Parents, teachers, waitresses, lecturers, or, whoever else. No wonder that has changed, and relationships. And I think what you've said is completely true. I often see it on social media where people are like, oh, romance isn't the same anymore. And it's all a bit, it's all a bit Instagrammable statement. But it is true. There is truth behind it. Courting doesn't happen as much as it did anymore. And you don't sort of like meet your childhood sweetheart at school and then cut to 25 years down the line, you're still married. And if you've had any bumps along the road, you've worked at it. because it's not going to instantly get better. You've had to put the work in. And I wonder if that is not going to necessarily be the case. I mean, I was listening to a podcast the other day to say, I mean, maybe this is a bit of a wild statement, but they were saying that, and this was for people like in their 20s, early 20s, late 20s, and before, that we are conjuring a society of people who will be perfect for divorce. We're conjuring a society where people will be experts at divorce because we are really good at moving on. We're really good at moving on. We're really good of like, oh, I don't need that anymore. Oh, that's disposable. Oh, I can cancel on you the morning I said I was going to meet you because I just need to text you. Oh, I can't anymore. It's so easy just to we're a throwaway nation. And what I wanted to ask you is, in the vast world of social media, we talked a bit about connection. Are young people isolated? Do you think young people are isolated? The notion that they don't really believe in themselves and they look at things from a distance without actually going and getting involved in the things. Do you think they're a little bit isolated because they're just watching it from afar thinking, oh, it won't be me?
Yeah, I think we have. I think children are isolated, and also I think different subgroups within our younger generation are quite polarized as well. So you've still got a subgroup of children that are always out. I live in Kent, and when I go into the nearest kind of very urban built up area, I might drive around. I'll see loads of children or young people out and about, hanging around bus stops like we did in the 90s. But they're not talking to each other. They're all individually on their phones scrolling. And that level of isolation I find really fascinating, that they're kind of with people, but they're not with people. They are still within their own kind of like little digital sphere, whilst they are standing right next to someone. And then I think we've got another demographic of people who are quite fearful. It's a sort of like a new stay-at-home generation, I think I would describe it as. Quite fearful of going out, or feeling like they don't need to go out because they're still connected to everybody, because they'll just they can carry on the conversation that they were having in period 6 this afternoon in English. They can carry on that conversation all through the night. So simultaneously they don't really get a break from each other, which then means that they don't have to make the same efforts to meet up with each other to share their news, or to talk about things, or to have decompressed from an event and then talk about it retrospectively. It's kind of like everything is just one constant real-time narrative, that it's sort of like the real life version of Infinite Scroll, I suppose, that there's never any natural breaks in anything. So I think that they do experience more isolation. I think that the rise that many national surveys have identified of increased issues with mental health in young people, it's not a surprise to me when I also see young people, very isolated and surrounded by this narrative that everybody else is perfect and everyone else has got their life in order, and also everybody has got to follow a certain schema through their life. You have to, get the best grades, you've got to make progress, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to get to the end result. And if anybody feels like they need to deviate from that pathway, then they don't know how to navigate that. And I don't think that we can ignore either I don't personally believe that the national lockdowns and the pandemic in itself is the cause of this, but I do think that it's accelerated it. So before that time, when, before the national lockdowns, young people were online, they were using their phones. But in the national lockdowns, a lot of children, I think, who would have been older when they first got their smartphone, got it a little bit earlier, because they had to access their school lessons, or because, they were FaceTiming other people, or perhaps they weren't able to see absent parents, or whatever it might be. And so they got online quicker. And as a nation, as a global community, I suppose, we all said it's totally okay for your children to have 6, 7, 8 hours of screen time a day because they're at school and they're doing this and they're doing that. And that's created a habit and a kind of like, well, they've been on the screen all day, they're fine. How do you can't really put Pandora, you can't really put that back in the jar. It kind of accelerated that process, I think, and that level of isolation, that I don't have to go out and communicate with people. I don't have to go around and see my granny. I'll just FaceTime her on my phone. And And I think that that is isolating. What was designed to be hugely connecting actually has been very isolating, and it is lonely. I think it is lonely. I think loneliness is, it's probably, perhaps it's quite an old-fashioned concept, that concept of being lonely, but I think we are living in an epidemic of loneliness as a society, because there isn't enough that connects us all together, and there aren't enough physical opportunities to connect with each other, because of work hours, or it could be cost of living crisis. Joining clubs is expensive for a lot of families now, and so it's really hard. And it reminds me, when my children were small, my oldest daughter, the highlight of her week was brownies. She would go to brownies. She loved it. She collected all the badges. She's still got her sash. It was a massive thing. And I don't hear, I think, when I started teaching in the 90s, and when I would talk to my students, I would, say, oh, what are you doing on the weekend? Or what are you doing? We'd be in conversation with them, and they would talk about going to guides, or the jamboree that they had on the weekend, or all these different activities. And over the years, I've noticed that children don't seem to have the same activities that they used to that are deeply connecting. There's still a good proportion of children that might have sports activities, and yes. I think that that's brilliant. I'm a big advocate of children engaging in that sort of activity. But the other activities that are perhaps less, have a less clear purpose, I think, are on the decline. And there are fewer brownies and guides groups, certainly around my area, than I remember even just a few years ago. And I think that that's a real shame.
It is. And I'm glad you said that, because when you said sporting activities, I thought, yeah, of course they're the only ones that are still, relatively popular compared to other clubs that children could be in, because you said it, they are purpose driven. And the problem is, because of the infinite scroll, and because of always being demonstrated with utter perfection, and watching your phone thinking, well, that's the end goal, then I've got to get to that. Nobody's enjoying the journey. And as your research said and mentioned, nobody is being mindful within their journey. No one is practicing mindfulness. We just want to get to the end product. I don't know what we think is going to happen when we get there, or what we think the end product is. One of my mum, one of her sayings to me is always, be careful what you wish for, and the grass isn't always greener. And
absolutely. Sometimes it's AstroTurf.
Exactly. And when she was growing up, she would have never needed to have been told that by my grandparents, because she said that when she was at school, it wasn't like a career advisor talking you through your university choices. It was go out and go to work. Or, like education was just so different, as Peter Kay would say, you had a thick table, things like, crazy things like this. And, you either were like, maybe you'd be okay for an apprenticeship, or maybe your family's just going to go out and work. But university, that's reserved for the real, high flyers. So my mum said we just got on with it. Whereas as the generations have come, the kind of like perpetuation of the world is your oyster, which is great, love that. But also with social media alongside the world is your oyster, you can achieve your dreams, you can do anything if you put your mind to it. That can be quite damaging. Because if you don't achieve what you want to achieve, then you've failed, haven't you? You've kind of failed. And so nobody's enjoying the journey, because all they're thinking is, I've got to get to what I want to achieve. Would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think everything is outcome driven. Absolutely everything is outcomes driven. And I've had conversations with young people over the years where they've like, I don't know what university to pick. What if I pick the wrong one? And constantly I'm saying to them, but what's the worst that can happen? So you leave and transfer to a different one, or there are always choices. And this striving for perfection and making the right decision, I've got one go to make a decision, and it's got to be the right one, I think is really arresting, and it is more likely to result in somebody not doing anything than giving things a go. And like I say, in the makes and men's lifestyle, so I sew those buttons on that cardigan and it looks a bit naff, so I'll take them off. It's okay. It is not, nothing is finished, nothing needs to be finished. We can just enjoy the moment that we are now. And I think the other thing that is really missing is, not just that sense of creativity and self-efficacy that I can give anything a go, and maybe it looks a bit rubbish, maybe it won't, maybe I'll learn something new. It's also a sense of playfulness, and I see less playfulness perhaps in the students that I teach now than I did perhaps back in the 90s. And, you know, young people and children have great capacity for playfulness. They can make games out of absolutely everything.
Yes.
And I really enjoy that side of them. And sometimes I have to have my cross teacher face on and I'm like, no, this is an English lesson and that's not what we're going to do. But inside I'm thinking, that was really funny.
Yeah, I love that. I love that so much.
Yeah, but we don't... I don't know when that stops, and I find that there is far less playfulness in the adult generation, and certainly in the young adult generation, this greater seriousness perhaps that they've got to get everything right. They've got to get the house, but they can't afford to buy one, and you know, well, I can't do this, and I've got to get this, and I've got to do that, and they're so serious that there isn't as much space for a sense of playfulness, and that playfulness can come from, you know, even just 1 minute of one day doing something just for the joy of what you are doing, rather than thinking, right, well, you know, I'll schedule it in my diary for next month. I'm going to do that mindfulness or that playfulness or that creativity. I'm going to schedule it in. And there's a lack of spontaneity, isn't there?
There really is. When I was in actor and theatre training, I was in this amazing... It was called the Talent First organisation, and the whole premise was to give actor training to children and young people of any background. So it was free of charge, which was pretty revolutionary, and nobody has done it since, because if you go to London and you try to train to be an actor there or anywhere else, the fees are pretty extensive. And one of the things that you learn when being an actor, and what makes really good actors, are people who have an innate sense of play. People who can play end up being better actors, because you know they are able to embody a character, mess around with ideas, and they're able to fail, because a lot of acting is failing. You try something and you go, oh no, that didn't work, but you don't just go, well, I'm not going to do the play now. You try again.
Imagine,
because you want to get, I know exactly, you want to get it right. And when I sort of like got a bit older, so I was like, I was reaching more like 18, 19, I started to volunteer instead. And I started to help with kids who were just like a few years younger than me. Like, you know, well, the youngest that I helped with was 8, and the oldest I helped with was about 15. And I noticed that sense of play had like gone, because I don't think the kids really understood the point of it. And I was like, no, there's no point. There's no point. There's no point. It's just play. Just play. Just enjoy it. You'll never know what you discover if you don't just play and enjoy it. But they wouldn't let go of their inhibitions, because, you know, social media was very much a thing, because it wasn't that long ago, so it was very much a thing. And so they were more self-conscious about themselves and how they were presenting themselves to the world. And the play didn't have a purpose. The only questions that they used to ask wasn't like, oh, why did this character stop speaking to her mum? Like, did the writer ever say that? It wasn't those questions. It was, do you have any auditions coming up? Is there any auditions? Is there any parts in Casualty coming up? Has the BBC been in touch? That was the driving force for them. When am I going to be on the telly? Basically became the driving force. Whereas only a couple of years or so before, with my little group, there was much more of a sense of mindful play. Paying attention like our life depended on it, just in the moment, and not thinking about anything else. And only a few short years later, that changed, and their focus was on something completely different, which was, when am I going to be on the telly? When are you going to get me an agent? And it became almost impossible to teach. And that's just acting. So how you must feel teaching, you know, genuine secondary school education. I can't imagine the challenges that you must see as the generations just keep pouring in. It must be kind of alarming sometimes.
Yeah, it certainly, I mean, it has been fascinating. I think if you're in any job long enough, you will begin to see the changes, and you know, in whatever role you're in. You know, for the children that you were working with, it sounds like everything was for the purpose of validation. You know, I can't come to this group unless I'm validated by there being a purposeful outcome at the end of it. Absolutely. I can't just go because it's good for my sense of community, or it's a break from the norm, or
you might learn a skill.
Yeah, or anything like that.
Yeah.
I think that education, or the role of education in society and attitudes towards education, have really changed since the pandemic. They really have. And I feel like sometimes now it's a little bit like, well, we used to feel like really worried about schooling, and that schooling was all and everything, and it had a greater kind of fearfulness is the wrong word, but certainly a greater kind of reverence. And then when children carried on learning, and we were doing live lessons 6 hours a day and connected like this for 6 hours a day with our classes,
wow,
it was, now it seems that well we stopped education, and there was a whole, there was 2-year groups that never actually sat formal exams, and the world didn't end. And so how important is education now, I think is perhaps a growing narrative. But paradoxically, it's still the case of, you have got to get the perfect grade, and you have got to go to the perfect university, and that sense of I need the outcome, I need everything to be perfect. But a misunderstanding that anybody can have that outcome, but it is hard work. Yes. Nobody can get an education on Amazon Prime. Yeah. And the reason lessons are hard, and I think that this probably boils a lot down to resilience as well. Anybody can do well in school, or anybody can do, can meet their own personal potential at school. But it's hard, but it's okay that it's hard. I wasn't very good at maths at school.
Same.
I found it very challenging and very upsetting, and I used to have a very visceral, emotional reaction to it. I did okay, I'm not like in numero or anything, but the sense of, if I'm in a higher maths class or a further maths class or something like that, and it's hard, it's because it's hard. It's not because there's something wrong with me. It's because it's hard. And you've got a choice. You can either embrace that and lean into it and think, yeah, it's going to be hard every minute of every day. I preferred not to lean into it. I prefer to lean into English, which I found much easier.
Ditto.
There is that sense of, I think it isn't just wanting things instantly. It's also a striving for things to be easy. And I think that is driven by technology in our world. Every single thing that is invented now is for the purposes of making jobs quicker, easier, giving the human more time. And I'm all for that. I don't want to be out there with a washboard doing all of my linens on a washboard. Yeah. I was a big fan when they invented the automatic washing machine. I think that was a great invention. Great.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They'll get a sticker for that one. But I don't know where we draw the line, because the whole point about releasing human time, because we've got these gadgets now that do things for us, I thought was so that we could connect with people, not so that we could just spend our time doing nothing, because otherwise what are we doing? And so I do worry about that. And I suppose one of the things that I genuinely do worry about is the the growing use of artificial intelligence, and how that is going to change everything all over again. And I don't know where we draw the line of deciding as an individual what is worth my time doing, and what is creative and purposeful and playful and makes me who I am, and what am I willing to give over to technology, to an artificial intelligence, and de-skill myself, I suppose. That is part and parcel. The cost, the value of it is that we haven't got to do that job, but the cost of it is that we are then de-skilled. That could we do that job if we wanted to? That's you're going to have to constantly weigh that up, aren't you?
Yeah, and where does society draw the line? I mean, on that Apple VR headset, on the advertisement video that my colleague was showing me, like, oh, look how cool this is. I was like, there was a bit where you could say, this is how you do a Teams meeting. Like, this is how you, like we're doing now, this is how you'd meet, wearing the VR headset, so you can see your colleagues and you can listen to them. What your colleagues will see, if you're wearing the VR headset, is an avatar that Apple has made of you. Hyper realistically. So what Apple's done is, so that you can actually be getting on with whatever else you want to be getting on with, or be doing nothing. So you can be just chilling on your sofa and still scrolling on other things while your colleagues are talking. Your colleagues will see a hyper realistic avatar of you talking and mouthing away to your voice as you're speaking. I mean, why? Why? I mean, I think there's the line. There's the line. That to me is one step too far, because like you say, if we're doing all of this to relieve human time, for us then to just become mindless scrollers, what on earth was the point? And my other question to you is, I mean, maybe there's no answer for this yet. Maybe there's still more research to be done. But how on earth do we tackle this then? I mean, we can get onto adults in a minute, but for our young people, and you being in the education system, and by the way, I commend all teachers who made it through the pandemic. Oh my goodness. Even the actor's studio I went to, all of that ended up being online, and the artistic directors had such a challenge teaching online. So commend all the teachers out there who did that. But how do we tackle this then for our young people and our adolescents to start with? What are our next steps? Because isn't this arguably just going to get worse?
I think I love living in the mid-century, world. When I say that I love the 40s, I don't mean the early 40s. I don't think we should be burying our dead every night after a blitz. I don't want to go back to all of that, terror. It was a real terror as a social scar on our world. I mean 1948 with Christian Dior's New Shape, and the early 50s with all of the new technology and the lovely cars and the music. That's the space that I like to live in. And if I could, sometimes people, particularly kids at school, actually, they say, "Oh, miss, if you had a time machine, would you go back and just live there?" And I think, that's a really great question. Would I do that? And I don't know that I would, because as your mum would say, the grass is not greener.
Yes.
Do I want to go back to a world of inequality where we would not be sitting here doing this because we would be women? And
quite right.
I mean, we are anyway, but back then we were women.
Yeah.
I don't want to dial the clock back on medicine and on equality and on tolerance and all those other ideologies. But do I want to slow down things a little bit? Yes, of course I do, but it's just so unrealistic. And I think, what we have to do, so I'm nearly 50, and what my generation has to do is understand that we can't just keep beating up on younger generations and say, you should be off your phone and you should be doing this and you should be doing that. I think we need to teach them how to use it really responsibly. And I suppose if I was in charge of the, whatever department it is that makes the rules for that kind of thing, I think if I was becoming a parent now, I certainly would delay as long as possible putting a smartphone in the hand of my child. I think that, they are as harmful as any other substance out there that you would not for a minute give to your child, is my personal view. Not the views of my organisation or anybody else that I know, but my personal view.
Of course, yeah.
But I think that, schools and education, we have a responsibility to teach them how to use these tools responsibly. We have a responsibility to know how they're being used and to keep our own knowledge base current so that we know what our children are being faced with, so that we can counsel them effectively. But also to provide them with alternatives, it's okay to be connected. It's okay to be using your smartphone. It's okay. You've got to use that technology. It's very rare now that you can, go into a bank. You have to be able to access things, in the digital world. Yes. But equally, there are other opportunities as well. And our children should still be going to guides and swimming and spending time with friends and on picnics and on nature walks and all of those things as well. And I think that what I would be an advocate of is just a greater balance, because all of those connecting activities are also good for parents and older generations as well. And we see loneliness at epidemic levels in our elderly as well.
Yeah, we do.
And being connected on a smartphone all day long is not the reason why our elderly generations are disconnected and isolated. So, I think that this is a wider conversation which we probably can't blame technology for in its entirety, is that society has just become more isolationist and we need to reach out a little bit more. And one of the things that because like you, I work really long hours, I'm studying all weekend, and I think I have experience. My children are all grown up. My youngest two are at uni now, so the house is quite empty. And I don't think that I have suffered from empty nest syndrome. That's not my bag, because I'm a busy lady and I've got lots of my own interests. But I think I have been able to recognise that if I woke up in the middle of the night, who would I call? for support? And also who would I attend support for? If somebody, who would ring me in the middle of the night saying, Miriam, I really need your help.
Yes.
And I don't know that I have that many people that would fulfill that role, because I've spent my whole adult life being really busy raising a very large family.
Yes.
And so I'm trying to find ways to connect with people, and I've decided to try and find a WI group. So I'm just going to try and join the WI, because I feel like that would be my jam.
I think it would absolutely. Maybe you'd be making jam as well.
I hope so.
You had 5 kids and you homeschooled them for a little bit as well,
yeah.
didn't you? So you've been a busy lady.
I've been a busy lady.
Oh, you should totally join your local WI group. I think that's absolutely fabulous. I often write about the WI for a character that I've made on TikTok called Evelyn. She is part of the WI and proud. I think people have varying opinions of the WI and what they think they represent. But in the war, the WI were absolutely crucial, and they were actually very progressive for women.
They really are.
So I think that's absolutely more power to you. I hope it's brilliant. I think it will be. And I agree. I think the generational gap, the generational divide feels wide, really, really wide, much wider than it's ever felt. I happen to think that's because of technology. Because now there is this, there's the young people are here on a phone sitting next to their grandparents, and their grandparents just don't have any concept of that phone. And I think that has been an actual divide, a bit of a wall. But there's probably a lot more aspects to why the generational divide is so wide. Have you got any particular?
Yeah, I think it is wider. Or maybe it's so hard to say, isn't it? I mean, I think every generation. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast about the historian that you were talking to and writing.
Yes.
And I think it was Socrates, wasn't it, who had a big beef with that. He was like, oh, this is going to be the death of us, all these young people writing things down, and they should be up at the Parthenon reciting poetry. He was very cross about it. I'm sure it was him, very cross. Yeah. And I think every generation has that. Every single generation looks at the upcoming generation and feels disconnected from them and thinks that they are further away than they are. It's really hard to say what role technology plays in that today, because a lot of my peer group I feel frustration with, because we might, be, I don't know, in a cafe or something, and I'm looking around the table and they're all on their phones.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard to say whether or not it is technology or not, or whether or not it is just a wider sense that all of society is more disconnected. I think that our younger generation, my heart breaks for them actually. I think that they experience far more pressure than I ever did at the same age. I think that life is harder for them. They have so many different landscapes to navigate with very little guidance. I mean, we're talking about, AI, we've been talking about social media, and these things are developing faster than legislation can keep up with. They don't know what the rules have got to be, what laws have got to be made until after that thing is out in the wild.
Yes.
And so I think the main issue is that young people don't necessarily know that the danger that they're in, and when they're sitting in their bedroom on their phone, it doesn't look like they're in any danger. No. But they are. And I don't know how we square that circle, I suppose. I think that we have to... I think part of the solution, of course, is that we're just really aware of it. And awareness is 50% of the journey, isn't it? Yeah, they do feel far away from us at the moment, but I don't know if that's just because of my age, whether or not it's true.
I think we feel pretty close, to be honest with you.
I think so. I like to think that a vintage lifestyle is timeless for anyone anyway. But
yeah. Would I feel close to an 18-year-old as I once would have done these days? I don't know.
No.
Do you know what I mean? I think I think the gaps are getting wider for all generations. Do you know what I mean? You get this whole like Gen Z and millennial arguments, warring on social media, and now you've got Gen Alpha chasing the tail of Gen Z. It's like, excuse me, we're all in this together actually, and
Absolutely.
everyone's on an individual journey. It's not a race. So what are we warring over? Like, who's doing things better, and the bloody millennial pause or whatever they I mean, I don't know if any of this means anything to you. It's just like random internet garbage that they.
It is random, and I think it's a real problem as well, because it just builds in a greater sense of otherness, doesn't it? And also justification. Well, I can't help my behaviour. I'm Gen Z, that's what we're like. And so there is that sense of kind of like abdication of responsibility, perhaps, for something that, you know, then becomes ubiquitously accepted. And when we start to dismantle things like social groups and social spaces, and we start to monetize everything, you know, taking your child somewhere now is always going to cost money. When that happens, then it's no wonder that society is less connected.
And that leads on quite beautifully to sort of the overarching theme of this podcast, about the reason why I'm certainly seeing more and more people deciding to live as though it were a slightly different era. Not necessarily living like it's that era, but living very inspired by that era, by a simpler set of standards and a different pace. Do you think it's a rising trend, or is it just the community I'm in? I'm seeing it more than the average person would.
No, it's a massively rising trend, and it's something that's kind of like, oh, I now do something that's trendy, and I didn't know that I was a trendy person, because I've always been interested, you know, collecting the press glass, and sometimes it breaks my heart. I look when I was a young adult, me and my then husband bought a Victorian house, and
cool.
I just didn't appreciate it at all. It was the age of changing rooms with Lawrence Llewellyn-Bowen, and it was rip this out and paint that purple and all that stuff.
Changing rooms.
And I know, and I just didn't appreciate it for what it was, and we moved on. We've had other houses since, and I love my house now, but it's a 1970s, very early 70s house, so I kind of justify it from the perspective that if I had been a young adult in the 40s, at the age I am now, I could easily live in a 70s house, but with a 40s, 50s influence, because
I love that.
I would have been a rising young adult at that time. So I've kind of created this pastiche for myself, but I have always enjoyed that kind of vintage aesthetic, I suppose, and have never really engaged in the trends of my own generation. And it was really unusual. So I wouldn't have been able to, you know, in the early 90s, or, you know, even in the mid 90s, gone down High Street and been able to find loads of, you know, retro patterns or retro clothes or whatever it might be.
No.
We didn't have kitchen appliances in the nice pastel colours to fit with the 50s, and so it has become really trendy, I think. But I do also kind of love it, because I have got a bit of an idea in my mind for changing my kitchen, having a freestanding kitchen with just lots of lovely cupboards. So yeah, I know.
Love that.
But no, it has become trendy, and I think that it is. I think that it is representative, perhaps of a wider, just a general rejection of and dissatisfaction with our current living age. It is a rejection of everything that appears to have become necessary or popularised, or perhaps even forced upon us as a society. And it's a rejection of the very worst parts of society, and a desire to find a time when those things didn't exist, maybe.
Yes.
I mean, there are other issues, you know, people say, oh, I love Call the Midwife, and I'm like, do you? Because a lot of those women, they weren't living very happy lives.
Absolutely. Like you said in your research, it's not just tea in the nunnery, it's you know,
really
people dying in childbirth and things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think it is a pushback, actually, against the structures of our society that are saying, you know, you've got to be a certain way.
Yeah.
And more people saying, why have we got to be like that?
Yeah, it's like a
Let's
weird, gentle, comforting rebellion, isn't it? Nostalgic rebellion.
It really is. I think it's.
I kind of like that.
Is it Pankhurst who was saying, I call this meeting to rebellion, or whatever it was that she said?
Brilliant. I didn't realise we were fighting the power, but actually it is a rejection, isn't it? And it is like, you know, I mean, when I said the rejection of modern, I didn't think like actually that was kind of like a movement, but I guess it is. I think we are, in a peaceful, nostalgic, sort of comforting way, we are rejecting the age that we are living in. And another thing in this podcast that I try and ask as many guests as I can remember to ask, I'm definitely going to ask you, is in that vein then, do you think it's a big statement, but do you think the modern world makes people depressed?
I think that modern living is making people unhappy.
Yes.
But I also think that I don't, when we talk about the rise of mental health issues and depression, even the depression that we talk about in conversation, not clinical depression, but
Of
certainly
course,
the
yes.
depression that we kind of referring to here in conversation.
Yes.
I think perhaps it wasn't talked about as much in the past. It was so much more taboo. And so it's hard to know if it's on the rise or if we are just now accepting that we need to recognise it and treat it and help people with that. So that's really difficult. But general unhappiness, dissatisfaction, absolutely. I think there are lots of things in our modern life that is highly dissatisfying, and that dissatisfaction is being treated with infinite scroll, with online shopping, with buying stuff, more and more stuff to try and fill that need and that dopamine hit, when in actual fact all that we actually really need to do is spend more time with other people.
You know what? I think that's the perfect closing point for this podcast. I could talk to you forever and a day. Genuinely, I find you fascinating. I knew this was going to be good. I knew it was going to be good, but this has been so valuable. I haven't been able to kind of like really bounce off somebody with those scrambly thoughts. I've spoken to some incredible people who are right there with me, but even they're kind of struggling to sort of conceptualize it and put it into words. I think we've done that a little bit today.
We have. I think we have. Yeah. It's been amazing. I think the next step for me, I want to get some more accessible writing out there, and I really want to focus on the idea of the makes and mends teacher, and that we've made teaching really overcomplicated, I think. But all teaching actually is just connecting with children and showing them how to do stuff and giving them new knowledge. So I think I really want to get some more mainstream teaching, and mainstream writing out there, I think.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I hope this is the catalyst for the start of that journey. I
hope so too. It's been so inspiring.
Thank you. And I'm inspired by you. This has been really, really brilliant. And I just want to thank you again, because we've really pulled apart some issues, and maybe in the future we could chat again about what I've learned maybe after speaking to all the other people I'm speaking to, because I think you're absolutely fab, and thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you ever so much, Hannah. I've had a lovely morning. Thank you.